Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. It's 2020, it's lockdown and it's empty. So this term we're conducting a series of interviews with key thinkers from around the world. And our theme is the fall of Jerusalem's magnificent temple in the 70th year of the first century. And we're reflecting on how the repercussions of that disaster have echoed throughout human history. The temple, after all, had been the meeting place of heaven and earth. It was where humanity encountered the other. But after the fall of the temple, in both Jewish and Christian tradition, it then becomes interpersonal, interhuman relationship that is the springboard from which humanity might just encounter otherness. Today we're very pleased to welcome Miriam Margolyes, who shares a personal narrative that weaves together elements of education and literature, experiences of alienation and anti-Semitism, and a profound concern for the other. Miriam Margolyes is a BAFTA award-winning actor, a documentary maker, a political activist, an authority on Charles Dickens, and a graduate of Newnham College here in Cambridge. We begin our interview with some readings from Scripture that will surface in the course of the conversation that follows.
One of the scribes came and asked Jesus, "What commandment is the most important of all?" Jesus answered, "The foremost is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." You have heard that it was said, "Eye for eye, and tooth for tooth." But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and offer the other cheek as well. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to those who ask of you, and do not turn away from those who want to borrow from you.
Miriam Margolyes, a very warm welcome to this digital version of Robinson College Chapel.
Thank you very much. I don't think I've ever been in a college chapel where I've had to speak. I've been to funerals and things, but nothing else, I don't think.
Can I begin by asking you, one of the things that you're famous for is terrifying, almost brutal capacity for openness. And lots of people think they're open-minded, but it's not a quality, it's not a skill that you can just turn on and off. And I wonder, is this something that you've always had? Has this always been part of your makeup, or is this something that you've learned and cultivated?
I think it's always been part of who I am. I like people, and I'm very interested in people, and I want to know everything about them immediately. And I don't waste time asking questions. I'm going to tell you, don't waste time asking questions. But it's not that I want to be brutally anything, really. I'm just consumed with curiosity.
I'll ask you a little bit more then about your experiences growing up. You came to Cambridge, to Newnham College, which is right there, and you studied English. You were taught.
Can I just interrupt you there and say, I came to Newnham College, Old Hall, where I was in residence, in 1960. But I actually came with an exhibition to study Anglo-Saxon. And then after about 3 weeks, I realized that people didn't speak Anglo-Saxon anymore. So I went to the tutor, head of the department, and asked if I would be allowed to swap into English. and I was allowed to do so. I probably should have said I'd study English at the beginning, and I don't know why I didn't. It wasn't a clever ruse to try and get into the English faculty, which was obviously oversubscribed. It's a very popular faculty. So that was it. And then I was in the English faculty after that. And yes, you're right, I did make Dickens my special subject. And he has remained my special subject ever since.
Well, often when I hear you talk about Dickens, it feels like you have this capacity to hear these multiple different characters extremely well. And of course, there are, I don't know how many characters there are in Dickens.
Over 2,000.
How many of them have you played?
Well, I think I've probably played about 30 or something like that.
And when you're portraying one of these characters, presumably you really have to listen to them well. And it's that capacity for listening well that I'm interested in. Partly because one of the emphases of this term being the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. And once the temple has been destroyed, rather than losing its geographical identity, Israel falls back on its communal identity, characterized above all by the Shema, the command to hear. And we all know that to hear is not just to keep your face hole closed for long enough for someone else to speak, but to enter into the world of another person. And that can be difficult and costly and sometimes even traumatic to do that well. Now, by playing these characters, is there a cost for you? Is there some kind of trauma involved in making yourself into these characters?
I don't think there's a trauma. I think Dickens has done all the work for me because he had a very good ear for dialogue and an extraordinary brilliance in reproducing people's ordinary speech. And he listened very carefully. And one of the great conundrums for me is when the characters, lower class characters, say Werry and Whittles, is that because that's what they said in those days? Was the Cockney accent using a W instead of a V, which they don't do now, or not? But in the famous example of Mrs. Gamp, which is a character that I adore and have played, she transposes her S's into G. So she says, and it's written, he has actually written it, dispose. So you know that Mrs. Gamp said dispose. You know that because he wrote it for you. So it's very, very easy to perform her because the work's all done. But I do listen to the characters that he writes. I do sort of hear them in my head. And I think that's how he wrote. He heard them in the street, and then he heard them in his head.
And would you engage with it differently if you hadn't studied English here at Cambridge? I think you were taught by the Leavises, F.R. Leavis, Queenie Leavis. What impact would they have had on your understanding of Dickens?
I had great luck in having Queenie and F.R. as my tutors. And that was thanks to our Director of Studies, Jean Gooder, because she brought them on board to Munich. I think that the Leavises made me realise that literature has a moral function, that it's not just for laughs, it's not just entertainment.
Mm.
It is actually about the stuff of life, about morality, about good and evil. They probably wouldn't have put it in those terms, but they had a high and serious commitment to literature. And I believe that I've inherited that. And anybody who has been taught by them would have inherited that same seriousness. So we regard the Cambridge English School as superior to the Oxford English School.
Well, they make you do Anglo-Saxon in Oxford, or they did, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And I don't know if it's still true, but their syllabus stopped at about, I don't know, 1914 or something like that. They didn't do modern literature in Oxford when I was going up. And I went to Cambridge in 1960 to 63. But the Leavises, I don't want to imply that the Leavises weren't fun. They were fun, but they weren't just fun. They were very serious as well.
Well, F.R. Leavis, I think, changed his mind on Dickens, didn't he? And
Yes, he did. He did.
And
I mean, that's a wonderful thing for a scholar to do, I think. To say, you know, I've thought about it, and I actually think there's more to it than I thought at the time. And I think he was right. Where I don't agree with him, with Dr. Leavis, is in the preeminence of Hard Times, the novel that Dickens wrote, which is probably my least favourite of his novels, and the one in which the morality tale is clearer and sharper than almost any other. And for me, it is rather dead and dry. I don't like Hard Times, but I love all the others. I think they're fantastic.
On the subject of morality, I'm sure you're used to people seeing people tut and shake their heads when they see you behave in certain ways in public. Is it true, when you were at Newnham College, that you were on University Challenge and you were the first woman to drop the F-bomb on the BBC?
Well, I believe I was. Yes. I don't know what the question was, but I got it wrong. And I said, oh, and that was, I don't think it was ever, it never went out in sound. I think there was a close-up of me going, but not actually speaking, because Ken Tynan was the first person to be in sound and vision using the word. It's not a great accolade to have received. And I have got a potty mouth. That is true. I love swearing, and I love bad words that you're not supposed to say. I enjoy using them. And sometimes I do quite naughtily. I know that. In other ways, I'm quite prudish.
It's interesting that you do have a beautiful voice. I think that's very widely recognised. And you had elocution lessons. Was it Mary Plowman?
Yes, when I was at school. You see, I think everything that we say has to be taken in a class context, because that's how I interpret the world, in a class context. And we are a Jewish family. My father was a doctor, the first member of his family ever to be at university. And my mother was the daughter of a second-hand furniture salesman. And so when she married a doctor, this was every Jewish girl's dream, to marry a Jewish doctor. Well, I mean, they're 10 a penny now, but in those days they were. And so she got her heart's desire. But that meant that she had to move up a class, because she was definitely lower middle. And so she was a very deliberate and practiced and determined social climber. Very much like Charles Dickens. I'm just going to finish what I was saying, because you were kind enough to mention my voice and to mention dear Mary Plowman, who did teach me elocution when I was at the Oxford High School, which was the school I went to when my parents' house was bombed. My mother was pregnant with me, and they went to Oxford to escape the bombing because their car was being repaired there. It was a Morris Oxford. And because my mother was suddenly transported from South London into Oxford, her social climbing became ever more necessary. And she was determined that I would sound posh, because she wanted me, as she always said to me, I want you to be able to talk to anybody about anything. And I think I can. I must be able to if I'm talking to theological students at Cambridge. That is something I will be very proud of after we finish. But it was that class longing that made me learn elocution and gave me this rather perfect diction, which I sometimes regret because I think it cuts me off from people. You know, in England, we judge everybody by the voice.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'm sorry about that because it cuts people off. So when I try to get onto terms with people I don't know, I usually put on a Scottish accent because my father was from Glasgow. So just falling into a Scots accent is very easy for me. I don't have to think about it because it was something I heard every day in my own life. And I'm perfectly at home talking like that. And it's a much friendlier sound than the sound of my own voice, which is a shame, but that's the truth.
Yeah. Would you make a conscious effort to shift your accent when you're speaking to people? I mean,
I think we all do.
Yeah.
And we all, when we're in a new group, we moderate our own voice to match the accent of the group. And so I do that perhaps over enthusiastically. Yes, I do. It's the sounds you hear when you're young, and they remain with you. And that's why I think Edward Heath always sounded so weird, because his accent was invented. That sort of, the vowels that were just on the edge of being unbearable. I don't know what it was, but the same with Robert Maxwell, who was a Czech emigre, and he had that sort of phony posh. Well, maybe mine is phony posh, but it is genuine.
Well, yeah. I watched The Matrix once, and there was a chap speaking about the French language. And he said it was his favourite language. He says, and swearing in French, he said it's like wiping your with silk. I think of that when I hear you swearing, because you speak to lots of people who don't have this, what you would call a posh accent. You do sound like you, the Queen. And so hearing that beautiful cut glass English accent with words that you wouldn't associate with it, there's something about that is powerful, I think.
Swearing, there are places that I wouldn't swear. I mean, if I met the Queen, I wouldn't swear in front of the Queen because it would be offensive and rude. But there are places where I do swear, and sometimes it pisses people off a lot. And, you know, tough shit, I'm just going to go on being the person that I am. And I know a lot of people do find me unbearable. Well, you know, what I do. I'm just a little old lady trying to make a living. So,
well, you're in good company. There's plenty of swearing in the Bible. It's just been translated out of it to make it, to sanitize it, to deodorize this image that we have of these sort of biblical saintly figures.
Do you believe in the Bible?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a Bible thumping evangelical, but because when you interpret it in its original languages, it leads you to a place that is wildly unacceptable to mainstream Christianity. So, for instance, I mean, you wouldn't describe yourself as a believer, I don't think. But there's so much of the virtue that's fundamental to Scripture, this is the reason I approached you, is that you embody a lot that people wouldn't usually regard as biblical virtue. I'll talk more about that when I ask you about farting, perhaps.
Well, I'm something of an expert on farting and not such an expert on the Bible. But I'm not a believer in God. But I am definitely a believer in good and evil. And I believe we have a choice. And I have always tried to choose good. I have never knowingly done an evil thing in my life.
Can I ask you, I heard you speak somewhere about how you interpreted Jesus. What would be your view of Jesus? You're not a believer in any traditional
Oh, yes, well, I think Jesus is a very good bloke. I think of him as a political leader. I think he was on the left. He was a bit of an iconoclast. You know, he tore up the statue, so to speak. I think that all the things that he asked of people, sometimes more than they could do, I think turn the other cheek as a pretty hard thing to do. But I think that he was absolutely a wonderful man. I mean, what an incredible impact he must have made on people who heard him speak and give sermons. I don't think he was the Son of God because I don't believe in all that. I just don't. But I think he was someone who lived and lived to the best of his ability.
It's interesting you use the language of turning the other cheek. The historical context is that when you get slapped, the convention was that if you're a Roman soldier, you can slap your inferior with the back of your hand, but it's only an equal that you would slap with the palm of your hand. So by turning the other cheek, he's saying you're going to bloody well treat me as an equal. There's a specific historical resistance, a passive resistance involved.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's wonderful. I love that. Well, that's like the translation of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, because the actual translation is the value of an eye for an eye and the value of a tooth for a tooth. So it's something that you didn't actually have to yank the tooth out. You could pay the value of the tooth.
That's something I didn't know. How terrible. In terms of politics, I mean, Jesus is a politician. Everything he's doing is political. The kingdom of God is a cry for regime change. The synagogues that he spoke in weren't proto-Baptist churches. They were debating chambers where you're there to inhabit this tension, this interhuman tension, and to try and work out what the right thing to do is in the midst of this conversation. And even the end of the world language he uses is concerned with the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. It's political from start to finish, and I think if you don't get that, you'll never understand the rest of it. So it's a great starting point. But I wonder if I could move you towards discussing your political views. I mean, they get you in trouble sometimes, don't they?
Yes, they get me in trouble with Jews. This is a source of sorrow to me because I am Jewish. I have always publicly identified as being Jewish. I will never even think of not being Jewish. I am not a Zionist, and that causes problems in the Jewish community because I'm felt to be a betrayer, a traitor, and some call me a self-hating Jew, which is absolutely nonsense. I love myself. But it does cause problems for me. I'm on the left, and I think that I'm further to the left than I used to be, actually. But I sort of waver between centre left and left. And I'm increasingly thinking about communism because I do find the disparity of income in the world to be one of the main sources of evil and problems. And so that if everybody had the same amount, it would be a jolly good thing, I think. I'm very simplistic, you see. I'm not an advanced thinker about anything. I just deeply believe in fairness. A fair go, which is what they used to call it in Australia.
Plato, I think, long before Marx, who said that in a city, in the ideal city state, once you've got 4 times as much as the least wealthy person in that city state, you should give all of it back to the state or be banished. This idea of having a fair go is nothing new, and it's.
When did you say that? What book? What?
It's buried away in the laws. I can't
Well,
remember.
I think he's dead right. I really do. I live in a street in Clapham in South London, which when I bought into it in 1973 was a very different kettle of fish. And now I am surrounded by bankers, people of enormous wealth, which they display and feel that it gives them the right to do various things and make a noise and have noisy leaf blowers and all that kind of stuff. In fact, it makes them bad neighbours. Money makes people bad neighbours. I'm just more concerned about poor people than most middle-class people ever will be. The poor are very much with us.
Mm.
And
You're quoting Jesus again.
well, I'm proud to quote such a clever bloke.
Let me ask you about your experience of anti-Semitism. Part of the theme this term is the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, and the recriminations that followed eclipse any persecutions that Christians have broadcast far and wide. The persecution to which Jewish peoples were subjected in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, was horrific almost beyond description. And I think it's echoed throughout history in one form or another. And you are heir to a tradition that has been on the receiving end of this normalized, systematic racism. I mean, is that something that has had much of an impact on you?
Yes, in various ways. I think my parents were very, very conscious of anti-Semitism. And their response to it was to say, don't make waves. Don't stick your head above the parapet. Behave well, always do the right thing, pay your taxes, treat people well, don't be noticed. Well, I did not listen to them, obviously. What I do meet from Jewish people is the rage and disgust at my attitude towards Israel.
Mm.
And that's a whole other manifestation of dislike. And one which wounds me actually more because it comes from my own people, so to speak.
Do you see any hope in bringing people in Israel and Palestine together in different ways?
If they can see each other as people, I do think there is a chance. But once you see someone as a human being, you don't really want to kill them. I want to understand what's going on.
Talking about bringing people together, I heard you tell Graham Norton that farting brings people together, and you'd never really thought about why. I don't want to trivialize the conversation or anything. I've long since wanted to write this book, Jesus Farted, because
I'm sure he did.
Well, if you break bread, you break wind. My Greek tutor in Oxford had in his class had a modern Greek student learning this ancient Koine Greek, and the word that used to mean to break bread now means to break wind. And apparently she translating it impromptu, she said, after they had eaten, Jesus farted and said, "This is my body." There's much more going on there, I think, than is appreciated. And of course, you can get a cheap laugh from it, but Christians are very bad at accepting the sheer humanity of Jesus. And it conjures an image of a God that everyone keeps at a safe distance from who they really are.
I mean, look, everybody does it. Some people do it more than others. I think I've got a sort of twisted colon. And for some reason, I don't wait to fart. I decide that if I want to break wind, I'm going to break wind. Now, if I think it's going to be smelly, I will tell people.
You give advance warning.
I always give advance warning. I always say I'm going to fart, and then I fart. If I think it's going to be smelly, I say I'm going to fart, and I think it's going to be awful. I think it's going to be a bad one, this one. It usually isn't. Sometimes it is. But mostly, I think it's just human. And when I fart, I notice that people laugh. Right. And that's lovely, isn't it? I mean, that's a wonderful thing. You can make people laugh. I just think that brings people together, makes them feel relaxed.
It's true. Yeah, it does sort of grease the wheels of human interaction, I suppose, at one level.
I hope not grease. That might not be like the word to use. But I know that when you're going out with someone for the first time, you probably don't fart then because you don't feel you know them well enough. Mm. And we love people in our lives. If we're lucky enough, we have people to love. We have our family members, and we have our partners. Mm. But are you from a poor home?
Yeah, pretty much. So I mean, I taught myself A-level, and when I was in the military and so on, and sort of climbed out of it that way.
What a triumph you are, Simon. What an amazing thing, and to go to Oxford. I mean, that I have an exalted respect for education because my parents did. Yeah. I've always, and I never thought that I was going to go to Cambridge because I never thought that I was smart enough to go to Cambridge. So I was amazed when I got in and incredibly grateful. But I'm going to tell a story that I often tell about my mother, who, as I told you, left school at 14. And Daddy was a doctor, and he was a doctor to Isaiah Berlin, who was a great public intellectual. And somehow she knew this. I don't know how this knowledge came to her. He was a fellow of All Souls, and he really was probably the most famous intellectual in England at that time. And she said to Daddy, "Joe, I want you to bring Isaiah Berlin over for supper." And he said, What are you talking about? I'm not asking him to supper. He's a patient. Come on. And she said, "Now listen, I want you to invite him to supper because I want him to be Miriam's sponsor for her university application." He said, "I can't do that. It's just not professional. It's not done." And she just said, "Do it." So Isaiah Berlin came to lunch, I think supper. Mummy was a very good cook of a traditional Jewish kind. We had roast chicken and all that. I was at the table, and Isaiah Berlin was at the table, Mummy and Daddy. He was delightful, completely unintelligible.
He was first boy was a son, so when I was probably eager in London to say, "But we was finding Meg is what I just think for. We are,
and it was like that. I couldn't understand the word he said. I don't know if Daddy could, but Daddy was his doctor because he had his parents with him from Latvia, And they only spoke Yiddish, and Daddy spoke Yiddish, so that was why. And Mummy asked him, Miriam is just about to fill in her applications for university. It would be so wonderful if you would be kind enough to be her sponsor on the application.
Oh, I was one of them. I will be start more education.
And listen, no university in the world would turn down somebody who was sponsored by Isaiah Berlin. Actually, she wanted me to go to Oxford, but I wanted to get away from my home, not because I didn't love my parents, but I knew that my development would be inhibited if I stayed at home. So I went to Cambridge, and it was a great decision, and it was a wonderful 3 years. And the people that I met there, the friends I made, they are the friends of my life. And she knew that. So I'm very grateful to my mother. It was just a vignette of my family life, which showed that my mother was the person who took the decisions and did things, and Daddy, cautious, nervous, followed in her wake. But he was a very good doctor.
Do you find yourself becoming more like your parents as you
Oh,
get
yes.
older?
I do become like my parents. I think my father had a very good vocabulary, and he was interested in words, which I am. And my mother was dictatorial and forthright, which I have always been, I think. So yes, I'm very much an amalgam of my parents. I just accepted their worldview and the way they lived. That was how you lived.
So, final question. Statues are a controversial topic at the moment, raising the question of how we remember and celebrate people. And forgive the stupidity of it, but if there was a statue of Miriam Margolyes, what would it say on the plinth?
Well, I hope that it would say actress and entertainer. She made a difference.
I'd love to know what difference you mean.
Well, I mean, I hope that I make people think a bit about the other. Because what I try to do is to go to people who are different from me, different from perhaps most people, and try and make you see life through their eyes. That's what you do as an actress. You go inside a person and you try to explain them to the people watching. You try to, in your being, you show why we are as we are. Because I feel that if people understand why somebody is like that, they won't hate them so much.
Miriam Margolyes, thank you very much.
I'm so pleased you asked me to be part of your series, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
That's